Hi, Red O'Laughlin here. I just finished a magnificent show on the Wise Ones with Dr. Jacqueline Kerbeck, owner of USA Global TV and Radio Network. And we had Sabine Becker on. And Sabine was a thalidomide baby back from the 60s, where she was born very deformed with no arms or very short arms. And she managed to get through life and become very effective. And then she had a massive stroke while driving, and she was laid up in the hospital for literally a year and had to learn everything over again. And she's an inspirational speaker, motivational. I still feel butterflies and everything just from listening to her talk. But a lot of times, particularly, I'm thinking to myself, she had such a massive amount of things happen to her, but her attitude, her positivity, and her mind was such that how can this person smile and just be content? No regrets, just gratitude out the gazoo. And I'm thinking to myself, there is a perfect example of, life gives you lemons and you make lemonade and you enjoy it. But we're in the middle of a 6-part series. I think today is number 4 on brain health and mental illness. We spent the first couple sessions talking about brain health and what we can do. Last week, we spent a little bit of time talking about some of the primary mental illnesses and mental disorders. And then today we're going to conclude, finish up with that one, hopefully get through the 5 that I want to talk about today. If not, we'll catch them next time. Now, I do not believe we're going to be meeting next week on Thanksgiving Day, so I'll be catching you in 2 weeks from now. But today we'll talk about the rest of the mental illnesses, mental disorders, define what they are, what are their causes, what are their treatments, symptoms and things like that, to give you a better idea of the fact that so many of these things intertwine and they are so hard to diagnose. And sometimes what may cause one or trigger something may not necessarily be the same trigger for everyone. So let me post my first slide and we will get going. And set this up here. And today we're going to continue on. Okay. I'm a researcher. I am not affiliated in any way, shape, or form with a medical industry. I'm not a doctor. Never been involved with the pharmaceutical industry. I fell in love with chemistry sophomore in high school, majored in it, got my degree, immediately got an invitation to Vietnam, so I never got a chance to practice it. But nowadays, I do practice it. I research the human body. I explore, I investigate. I want to know what's going on at the cellular level, chemically speaking. I look for cause and effect relationships. Treat a cause and you fix a problem. Treat a symptom and you'll always be treating symptoms. And so that's what I concentrate on. That's what I write about. That's what I speak about. And most of my books nowadays are on health and wellness, and I concentrate primarily in the area of longevity. Mental illness, I'm defining mental illness as those health conditions that involve some kind of change. And it could be the change in our emotions, our thinking, our behaviors. And most of the time, that trigger is some level of distress. And we find ourselves having real problems dealing with social, work, or family activities. Sometimes not so bad, sometimes, a little bit more than that. Terminology. We talk about mental illness, we talk about mental health, we talk about mental disorders. There seems to be more than a whole host of terms that we use to describe the same things. I'm sure many of us heard the terms neurosis, fixation, quirks, mental derangement, mental disorder, mental disturbance, mental instability, psychological disorder, psychological maladjustment, personality disorder. Sometimes we have poor mental health, and maybe that time is not quite into the level of being classified as a disorder, but it's almost touching, it's on the cusp. And we have problems with our moods, our behaviors, our thinking. And those things happen, and sometimes they're easily correctable, sometimes they're not. And most of the things when you look about on mental illness, they're going to tell you, can't cure it. Alzheimer's, no cure. Whatever it is, there's no cure. Well, sometimes we can arrest these things or at least temporarily slow the progression. But when we talk about mental illness, the things that I've been talking about here, I'm talking about anxiety disorders. And when you look at 1 in 4 people in the world have some kind of mental illness, they're usually referring to some kind of depression or anxiety. People are irritable, they're worried, they may have panic attacks. OCD, that obsessive control disorder, everything has to be perfect. We have bipolar, another term that's used in there. Mood disorders typically means a major depression, more so than just, oh, it's got a little bit of a mood issue. We have eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, etc. We get personality. You're schizoid, narcissistic. We talked about PTSD last week. But there's just a lot of things in there. Sometimes they get into delusions and hallucinations. And then you have another whole branch of things which now deals with our cognitive ability to think. And we classify them all generally under the term dementia. But there's at least a half a dozen different kinds of Alzheimer's. There's Huntington's, there's Parkinson's, and there's others. And so there's just a lot of different things we throw out there that we call a mental illness. But let's just go ahead and continue on. Last week I talked about anxiety, depression, bipolar, and PTSD. Today my plan is to talk a little bit about schizophrenia, eating disorders, addictive behaviors, dementia, and then I added ADD, ADHD because I felt like it's something that we're constantly exposed to, particularly if you have kids, but not even just the kids. Some of us adults have a problem with that sometimes. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Schizophrenia. Basically, the doctors say it's a persistent mental disorder, characterized by thought, perceptions, and emotional response, and our ability to interact socially. So we have a mental disorder that affects just about everything we do. Sometimes it could be severe, in which case, this guy's really schizo, or it can be disabling to a fact that, you had to be hospitalized. Typically, we see delusions, hallucinations, slurred speech, somebody who's extremely disordered, somebody very negative, somebody who can't quite master being able to put a square peg into a round hole or the round hole into the round peg. So those are things that typically identify that. But as we go through, as we learned last week, and as we go through the additional ones this week, many of these same things occur when we start talking about our emotions, our moods, our negativity, those kinds of things. They just seem to be overlapped. And how does one person know that you just have a simple depression or you have something much more severe than that? That's what the doctors are there to tell us. What are the causes of schizophrenia? Well, for the most part, they don't know. They absolutely don't know. They think it's brought on by some kind of severe stress, a death in the family, a job loss, maybe abuse as a child, maybe even genetic. It could be something passed on down. But they honestly don't know. Some people develop it, some don't. And when some of these things are genetic, then that even throws it into a bigger problem, because all of a sudden somebody turned a gene on and you became schizophrenic. But genes are like a light switch. They can be turned on and off. Epigenetics is our lifestyle, the things we do on an everyday basis, that sometimes because of too much of this or too little of this, we may actually activate a gene, maybe for the good, maybe not for the good. But those things are about, in most cases, about 5%, sometimes a little bit more. So if you have something from your parents, no guarantee you're going to get it. But it's one of those things that does need to be taken into consideration, particularly when you start getting to Alzheimer's and some other things. What do they typically treat schizophrenia with? Well, usually it's some kind of individual psychotherapy. They want social skills training, family therapy, these drugs, anti-tremor, antipsychotic. In some cases, nutrients. Deep brain stimulation is another one that's going on right now. And some of you'll find that a lot of these treatments are the same treatment no matter what the mental illness is. It's kind of strange why all these things seem to work. I prefer start with a clean slate. If you're deficient in some kind of nutrient, let's take care of that first. Let's get your body balanced nutrient-wise across 30, 32 different nutrients the body needs on a daily basis. Keep it that way for 2 or 3 weeks. If you still have the problems, now you have something to go on that's not a magnesium deficiency or a vitamin B12 deficiency, which can cause cognitive problems or mimic Alzheimer's. And those things are if you don't research and find out, well, am I deficient in this? Well, maybe you're deficient in something, but you're being treated and given psychotic drugs for a reason which could have been prevented. I'm just more like to know what's really going on from a nutritional perspective. A big category, eating disorders. It just runs the gambit here. But essentially something that's abnormal or disturbed eating. We have anorexia, bulimia, alternate diet, binge eating. And these things are episodic, and sometimes they involve large quantities of food. But anorexia and bulimia, and they're a little bit different as far as how they manifest themselves, uh, we see symptom-wise. Sometimes the weight on a person goes up or down. Some people are really preoccupied with their body image, and you tell them, "Why are you dieting? You're not overweight." And they look at themselves, "Oh yeah, I'm overweight," but they see something that we don't see. Even though you can tell them, they can look at a mirror, they can look at the weight charts. Yeah, you're right there in the middle of the norm or low norm, but they don't see it that way. Uh, Eating pattern disruptions, preoccupation with nutritional content, changes in exercise programs, again, mood swings, excessive use of laxatives. These are typically seen, and I'm giving you the generic for the eating disorder and not necessarily a specific for bulimia. Those things are available. Just go to Dr. Google or Dr. YouTube, and you can find more information than you want. But this is an awareness program. We're beginning a level of education so that you can say, hey, doctor, uh, what about this or this? I think this is something that so these are things that you file away in the back of your mind or you make notes on. You go see your doctor and say, hey, what about possibly doing this? And that I think is of immense value. What are the causes of eating disorder? Well, some classify it as a family history. Um, Sometimes you have another mental disorder and this becomes a side effect. But really and truly, a lot of it, I think, really happens under stress. We have people with self-esteem. They do not recognize themselves for who they are. The lady we had on the last show, Sabine Becker, she was born with very tiny arms because uh, she was her mom had thalidomide when she was a baby and it caused birth defects. But she didn't see herself as any differently. In fact, we were talking and she wanted to grow up and be a airline stewardess because her parents told her she could do anything she wanted. And then later on, she had a massive stroke that put her out of commission for about a year or so before she was back to being semi-normal again. And then before she became fully normal, and then she ended up running a marathon. But self-esteem is how we see ourselves. And that is a big problem, even for those people who don't even have eating disorders. Just self-esteem in general is a major problem. How you treat it? Well, cognitive behavior therapy. We've heard of that one before. Self-image or self-worth kind of improvements. Stress management, family support. Sometimes a nutritional education helps. Support groups also help. A lot of different things in that particular area of eating disorders that can be addressed and are worth doing that. Addictive behavior. Now here again, just like eating disorders, there's so many kinds of addictive behaviors. Most of the ones we kind of hear about is alcohol, drug abuse, but we have some kind of compulsive uh, drug use or physical or social consequences. I mean, it may not necessarily involve a drug. It may be sex, maybe gambling, maybe internet, maybe shopping, video games. Some people are obsessed with plastic surgery. Binge eating obviously is an addictive behavior. Some kinds of food, thrill seeking. Just because it's not drug, and that drug can be illicit or prescription, addictive behavior is something that comes about. And symptoms are typically seen as a problematic pattern. And that's the key word, is you have a pattern of use. You have powerful cravings. You got relationship problems. If you have a health problem, it's ignored. You have these obsessions. We talked about thrill seeking, increased risk taking. Sometimes you don't want people to know you have a problem, so you seek solitude or secrecy. Denial is a big one in this one. No, I don't have a problem. No, it's financial problems because you're having to buy whatever you're needing in order to meet the requirements of your addiction. Always, you're going to have in most of these things some kind of sleep problem. And another one that's typical, very typical, is the fact that you're spending so much time chasing this addiction that you disregard your own appearance. And again, these are generic. They do not say that if you have a gambling addiction, you're not going to look good. These are generic, and that's all they're meant to be. If you think you have a gambling problem, there's Gamblers Anonymous. There are lots of information out there on how to identify it. But these are things just from an educational awareness perspective. Addictive behavior. What are the causes? Well, most scientists tend to think it has something to do with our environment. We're exposed to something that's an addictive substance, and all of a sudden, whoa, I like that. Let me try it again. Sometimes it's social pressure. Sometimes it's lack of social support. In other words, neglect, particularly as a child. Some of us have better coping skills than others. Sometimes we lose a family member, and somebody in the family just can't get over it. Just they just live with that loss every day. Yes, you do need to grieve. Yes, there is a time for all that, but coping skills are something that can be learned. Sometimes poverty is part of the cause. Uh, Trauma, very much so. I think I've seen that on more than just a few that I was doing research on. You may have an undiagnosed mental illness, like we talked about on the eating disorder. Sometimes that is a side effect of something else. Chronic stress is such a big part of our mental psyche that it becomes a trigger for many of these things. Chronic pain. Sometimes you start out and okay, I just need an aspirin for this, and maybe it's two, maybe it's three, and all of a sudden, now we go to something a little bit more powerful, and now you're going to the doctor for something, and all of a sudden, what started out as something that may have been able to be controlled, but now we're out of control because we're now addicted to something. What are the treatments? Well, obviously, it's the behavior, so behavior counseling. Uh, if you can identify what the triggers are that starts all these things, awareness is a big plus in being able to okay, if I know what it is, I see it coming, I can better address it. But if I don't know what it is and that trigger, snaps and boom, back in whatever it is again. And this applies to all aspects of mental illness. Exercise is such a wonderful treatment because it gets the blood flowing, the oxygen through the brain. It acts as a stress relief. There's just a lot of issues there with exercise that really and truly work. Detox, cognitive behavior therapy. We've heard of that one several times already. Talk therapy. This is one-on-one. Group therapy, one-on-many. Then you have a couple of different drugs there, naltrexone and buprenorphine. And there's some other ones. I just picked out the two major ones in that particular one. Okay. One of my favorite subjects, and I've talked about it here on Talking Heads before, specifically Alzheimer's. Dementia is a general term. It's not identifying a specific disease. In many cases, you almost have to have a biopsy of the brain after you're dead to find out what you really have. But a lot of the symptoms are similar, particularly on the front end. But for us, a generic term is the inability to remember something, our inability to think clearly, to make decisions. And these are the things that we need to operate on a daily basis to be normal. So if we start losing these abilities, all of a sudden, that might fall in the category of dementia. What are the symptoms? Well, memory loss, obviously, that's a big one. Difficulty communicating, well, maybe not right on the beginning cusp of these things, but certainly as the disease develops. Difficulty solving problems, absolutely. Difficulty planning and organizing, absolutely. When you start getting really confused about the time and place, now that's probably a very good indicator that, yeah, you have a mental problem somewhere that's causing your cognitive ability to not shine and be as good as it used to be. And obviously mood changes, those are always common in most kinds of mental illnesses. Now, this is one that I almost have to laugh at a little bit. I wrote a blog a couple days ago because for most people, they're going to tell you dementia, in this particular case, Alzheimer's, is plaque buildup in the brain. Well, it turns out that about 2006, there was a study done. And when you look at the actual evidence that they proposed to say, hey, here's my evidence, well, there was something missing, a little bit of photoshopping, a little bit of this, that, whatever, I don't know. A lot of stuff in there suspect. And I'm talking about not a little, like 80 different photos of things saying, well, here's our proof. And when you try to reconstruct it, redo it again, and verify it, they can't do it. And so a lot of the research that has gone on tied to this plaque buildup in the brain, your beta amyloid beta protein, basically, is now being suspect. And a lot of the drugs that were developed to kind of address it are now saying, well, maybe that's not necessarily the case. But you do have a plaque buildup that does happen. You do have a tau protein that gets tangled and causes problems. And those are two of the well-known ones. But anytime you have any kind of problem in the brain, generally you're going to have some level of inflammation that's there, some level of oxidative stress. Sometimes you have an exposure to toxins that affect the brain. Genetics, the APOE4 gene is one that is most prevalent there. Just getting older, that's a cause of a lot of our aging dementia issues. Sometimes we have these gene mutations. I talked about the APOE. gene. That's one that definitely has a problem. Excitotoxicity, depending on what's going on in the brain, because we have a lot of different synapses going back and forth, the electrons communicating. And when you have that, it's sometimes it operates in just a normal level. Let's say their speed is 55 to 70, and you're operating in that, and everything's fine. And sometimes, whoa, you're up 85, 90, and now you're really overdoing what the pathways, the brain path can handle. And sometimes it's a nutrient deficiency. I mentioned vitamin B12 being one that mimics Alzheimer's. That's why gerontologists will give you a B12 shot to see if that snaps you out of it. Magnesium is a big one. There's a magnesium L-treonate. It's a particular kind of magnesium that literally in about a week, 2 weeks, you'd be amazed at how well the brain responds to having some deficiency in magnesium. But magnesium deficiency does cause cognitive decline, cognitive inability. You have a few drugs for treatments: Aricept, Exelon, Reminil, Levodopa. And when I start looking at some of these things, antidepressants, diet, and supplements. Supplements, I want to stop there for a minute. Supplements, and it may be a number of different things. One of the ones that I've found to be very, very effective in the treatment of Alzheimer's is one of the four phospholipids that our body makes. It's called phosphatidylserine. Well, phosphatidylserine passes through the blood-brain barrier, and it is needed. As we get older, we make less and less. Well, fortunately, you can buy it in pill form, take it. My brother-in-law had Alzheimer's. He got to a point, he was a Catholic priest, and he could not say Mass anymore. He finally moved in with his younger brother, and we put him on the phosphatidylserine. And in less than 2 months, even though he couldn't even tell you what year it was, he could tell you what was on TV last night, what he had for breakfast, what was on TV tonight. It was like he didn't have Alzheimer's for a number of months. But like any other kind of disease, it's just not one pathway a disease progresses. So you may be able to stop one pathway in its tracks, but that doesn't mean that another pathway is also running down parallel tracks. So you may have a buildup of plaque you can stop, but maybe the tau protein tangles continue to tangle. And so supplements, I think, are very, very good. PQQ, I think, is one of the best ones for the brain. Pyrroloquinolincanone. It passes through the blood-brain barrier and can be reactivated 25,000 times, assuming you have enough glutathione. And what else is in there? Just a lot of different things. Exercise, a lot more oxygen getting to the brain. Stress management, so many problems caused by stress. I'm going to say, seriously, you almost need to manage stress on about an hourly basis. Certainly 4, 5, 6 times a day. Take a deep breath. I love to say, take a deep breath, hold it for 30 minutes. And then they finally hear 30 minutes, not 30 seconds, and they start laughing. But taking a deep breath, smiling, laughing, exercise, all are great. You've got breathing exercises, pranayamas. I love doing those. But there's just a lot of different options out there. EFT, emotional freedom techniques. Increasing our social interaction. Sometimes just being around others is enough to help with our ability to communicate better. Acupuncture, ultrasonic energy in the brain targeting the globus pilatus. That's one that's really finding a lot of improvement nowadays in Alzheimer's. Handrails. I mean, we don't think about that, but if we're going to have a problem, say with Parkinson's, and we can't hang on very well, and we don't have handrails around the house, in the bathroom, wherever you're at, bedrooms, etc. Maybe that's something you might want to seriously consider, because if somebody's going to have a problem and it's going to get worse before they end up in a wheelchair and they're going to get themselves hurt going from one room to another, that's a fairly inexpensive solution. There's, as I mentioned earlier on, there's a dozen different kinds of Alzheimer's. You got Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Huntington's and vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, Wernicke-Korsakoff, Down syndrome, and there's others. But trying to get down into the Wernicke-Korsakoff, there's not that much of it. But yeah, there's probably a fair amount of Lewy body, there's a fair amount of vascular dementia, certainly a whole lot of Parkinson's. And it was interesting that I found that several years ago that you put a Parkinson's patient on a bicycle and let them stationary bike, and they bicycle for 30 minutes, and all of a sudden it's like their Parkinson's goes away for an hour or two. Same thing, you put them on horseback, and there's just a lot of things out there that are working for each one of these different kinds of diseases. But dementia is one that's very, very difficult because it affects not only the individual, but the family as well. And if it's something simple as phosphatidylserine uh, deficiency, well, that's fairly easy to address. So when I start talking about let's balance all of the necessary nutrients first before you start looking at what is really wrong, I think you're at an advantage when you do that. Okay, I'm getting toward the end here. ADD, ADHD. Again, several things working here. We tend to think of this more for kids, but ADD, attention deficit disorder, essentially inattention, distracted easily. They poor working memory. ADD also has this cousin called ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And it's basically the same things as ADD, but you get a little bit more impulsiveness or a little bit more hyperactivity. And so they add that H in there to signify that this is just a level above ADD. And what do we see? Primarily symptom-wise, constant fidgeting. They just can't sit still, excessive physical movement, excessive talking, uh, inability to wait your turn, sometimes acting without thinking, interrupting conversations. A big problem lifting things undone. Can't get organized. A very, very, very easy one. Again, from a systematic perspective, it looks easy to identify, but then again, there are other things in there that have similar ones. But what are the causes? Consensus is brain injury. A lot of them, when they want to put it back to having some kind of exposure to the mother when they're pregnant, and whether that exposure is toxins or alcohol or tobacco. Maybe the baby was born with a low birth weight, maybe premature delivery. There's a certain amount of study that says genetics is in there. I want to also add in that Dr. Berg, somebody I follow, DERG, Dr. Berg, he seems to think a lot of ADD, ADHD, and along with what is the book, Grain Brain by Perlmutter. They talk about how sugar, gluten affects our brains and gives us a lot of this depression, anxiety, in some cases ADD, ADHD. Sugar is a very, very potent chemical, and it causes a lot of inflammation in the brain. In fact, even sometimes Alzheimer's referred to as type 3 diabetes. But sugar and gluten may be two areas, if there's a problem out there, that, hey, maybe you just want to back off for a while on that one and just let things be. There's so many different kinds of medications that people use for that. I'm not going to go through them. They're in the slide. Most of them are very difficult to pronounce regardless. But other things that can be done, diet, I just mentioned some of that, exercise. If it's a toxin exposure, maybe toxin removal. Maybe it's an allergen that you have. What are you allergic to? Could it be chocolate? Could it be red wine? Could be half a dozen other things. Let's find out what it is and remove that from your body. Yoga, Tai Chi, behavior therapy. In some cases, EEG feedback is very good for treating that. And so those are the things that we kind of just wrapping up this week's program. I have a couple books that are available on my website, red.olaughlin.com. That's REDOLAUGHLIN, red.olaughlin.com, or on Google. The Joy of Ageless Health talks about the primary causes of disease and what you can do about it, starting from basically chronic low-level cellular inflammation. Longevity Secrets to Healthy Aging is another one of my books. I talk about the two primary causes of aging, your human growth hormone decrease in production as we get older, and also the rate of loss of our telomeres at the end of our DNA. And I talk about how you can address each one of those. But we're going to continue next week. I'm going to get into your second brain, your stomach, your gut, and how that plays with the primary brain, and how gut issues can manifest themselves into mental problems, and how sometimes our mental problems can manifest themselves into stomach issues. We've heard of having ulcers and things like that with regard to being stressed out. Well, we're going to go ahead and continue next week. And until that way, next week is actually going to be Thanksgiving 2022. So we're going to meet you the Thursday after Thanksgiving 2022. And I'm going to conclude on that note. And again, this is Red O'Laughlin on the USA Global and TV Radio Network on the Talking Head Show. Bye now.